The afternoon sun was beginning to sink when a quiet girl named Lena wandered down the narrow street that led to the old music conservatory. She often liked walking this way after school, even though it took her the long route home. Something about the sound of distant piano notes drifting through the open windows always made her feel peaceful. Most days she simply listened from outside, but today the door stood open, and voices floated out as if inviting her in. She stopped at the entrance, unsure whether she should step inside. Lena wasn't the type to walk confidently into new places. She usually kept to herself, and although she had played piano for years, it was something she practiced quietly at home. She almost never played for others. But something about the open door tugged at her curiosity. She could hear scales being practiced, and then a firm voice giving directions. Whoever was teaching sounded strict, maybe too strict, but she felt drawn in anyway. Taking a slow breath, she stepped through the doorway. The conservatory smelled faintly of old wood and sheet music. The hallways echoed with uneven footsteps and the occasional burst of laughter from students who clearly knew their way around. Lena walked softly, staying close to the wall, hoping not to disturb anyone. She didn't plan to stay long. She only wanted to catch a few minutes of music before slipping away. As she approached the main room, she heard a piano being played with such speed and control that she froze at the doorway. A tall man with sharp eyes and silver-touched hair stood beside the instrument, listening with arms crossed. Even without knowing his name, she could tell he was someone important. His posture, the way the students watched him with a mix of fear and admiration, everything about him suggested he was a master at what he did. Lena didn't want to interrupt, so she stayed near the door, as quiet as possible. She watched the student at the piano, a young man who looked nervous even though he was playing a complex piece. The teacher corrected him often, sometimes stopping him mid-measure to point out a mistake. The student nodded each time, though his hands were trembling. When the piece finally ended, the teacher gave a short, sharp comment about focusing more on dynamics. The student quickly stood up, relieved to be done. As he stepped aside, the teacher's eyes drifted across the room and landed directly on Lena. She felt her heart jump. She immediately looked down at the floor, hoping he would ignore her. But she could sense his steps as he approached. "Are you here for the class?" he asked, his tone stern but not unkind. His voice carried the kind of strength that came from years of commanding attention. Lena shook her head quickly. "No, I was just listening." The teacher raised an eyebrow. "Listening from inside the room?" She swallowed, unsure what to say. The door was open. He studied her for a moment, as if trying to decide whether she was telling the truth or making an excuse. Then he gave a small nod. "This is a master class," he said. "Not usually open for visitors. But since you're already here, you can stay as long as you don't disturb the lesson." Lena nodded quickly. "I won't." She stepped to the side, hoping to blend into the corner and disappear, but the teacher's eyes lingered a bit longer. He seemed curious, though she didn't know why. She wasn't dressed like a music student, and she certainly didn't look like someone ready to perform. More students took turns at the piano, each one receiving strict corrections. Lena watched quietly, fascinated. She had never heard such skilled playing in person before. These weren't beginners. They were people who lived and breathed music. Every note they played carried confidence. She felt a mix of admiration and something else, an ache, maybe. She loved the piano just as deeply, but she had never imagined herself in a place like this. She didn't think she was good enough. After several performances, the room grew quiet. The students looked tired, and the teacher finally stepped back from the piano, letting out a slow breath. "That will be all for today," he said. "Unless—" His gaze shifted again straight toward Lena. She stiffened, unless our guest would like to try." Her heart dropped. She didn't know whether he was serious. The students turned to look at her, some curious, some confused. She felt her face warm with embarrassment. "Oh, I wasn't here to play," she said quickly. "I just came to listen." The teacher tilted his head slightly. "You're standing in a piano masterclass. It seems unusual to be here if you have no connection to music." "I do play," she admitted softly, "but not like this." She motioned toward the students, who were clearly far more advanced. "What do you play?" The teacher asked. "Mostly classical pieces," she said, "but only at home." He considered her words for a moment. Then, with a subtle gesture toward the piano, he said, "Why not show us?" "Just a few minutes." Lena shook her head again, feeling overwhelmed. "I don't think I'm good enough for this class." The corner of his mouth twitched, almost like he was amused. "How do you know, if you never try?" The student's stares grew heavier, and she suddenly wished she had never walked inside. She backed up a step, ready to apologize and leave. But the teacher spoke before she could. "If you're going to listen," he said firmly, "at least let the instrument hear your hands. A musician should not hide from the piano." His words struck her in a way she didn't expect. She had spent most of her life hiding not just from others, but from the possibility that she might actually be good at something. She looked at the polished keys, feeling the familiar pull she always felt when near a piano. The room stayed painfully quiet. No one moved. No one even cleared their throat. All eyes were on her dot. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear of playing, but from being watched. She had played difficult pieces before, but never with an audience. Never with someone as experienced as this teacher observing her. Still, something inside her whispered that she should try. Slowly, she stepped forward. The teacher moved aside, giving her space at the bench. She sat down carefully, feeling the smooth wood beneath her fingertips. The piano was much grander than her simple upright at home. It felt alive, as if waiting for her to bring it to life. She rested her fingers lightly on the keys, though she still didn't know what she should play. She didn't want to choose something too easy, but she also didn't want to embarrass herself by attempting something beyond her level. The teacher stood beside her, watching closely. She could feel his presence like a shadow. "Well?" he prompted. She took a slow breath, and then the faintest smile touched her lips, because suddenly she knew exactly what she would play. A simple piece. One she had practiced so many times that it lived in her hands like a quiet secret. One that reminded her why she loved the piano, because it allowed her to say things she could never say out loud. She pressed the first note. Soft, clear, steady, and the room, once filled with tension, seemed to settle into stillness. She didn't know what the teacher or the students were thinking. She didn't dare look up. All she knew was that in this moment, the piano didn't feel like a challenge. It felt like home. She had no idea that this small moment, this quiet beginning, would lead to something far greater than she could imagine. The moment Lena played her final soft note, the room stayed completely still. She had expected someone to whisper or shift in their seat, or maybe the teacher to immediately correct something she did wrong, but no one moved. The quiet pressed around her like a blanket, making her even more unsure of what she had just done. She pulled her hands slowly away from the piano, letting them fall into her lap. Her fingers were warm from the keys. She didn't dare look at anyone, especially not the teacher standing beside her. Finally, his voice broke the silence. "You chose something simple," he said, his tone unreadable. Lena nodded slightly. "It's the one I'm most comfortable with." "Comfortable," he repeated, almost to himself. Then his eyes narrowed just a little, as if studying her more deeply. "Do you know why pianists struggle? It's not because they lack talent. It's because they refuse to step past comfort. Her stomach tightened. She wasn't sure if he was criticizing her or preparing to. The students in the room shifted uneasily, sensing something was coming. Then he stepped forward and pointed at the piano bench. Again, but something harder. Something that tells me what you can really do. Lena felt her chest tighten. She whispered, "I don't know if you do." His tone was firm, not harsh, but full of certainty. "I can hear it in your touch. You're not a beginner. You're hiding. Why?" His question felt too big, too personal. But refusing him seemed impossible. There was something about his presence that pushed people past their limits, like he could see through every excuse. Lena looked at the keys, then back at him. "I'm not trained like your students. I've never had a teacher." That seemed to surprise him. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Never?" She shook her head. "I learned by watching videos and listening to recordings. And I read sheet music at home. That's all." The teacher stared at her in silence for several seconds. A few students exchanged quick glances. Some looked doubtful. Others looked impressed. Finally, he spoke again, quieter now. "And you played like that with no training?" Lena didn't know if she should nod or shrug, so she did neither. He took a slow breath, then said something she didn't expect. "If that was your comfort piece, then I want your challenge piece." Her heart thumped. I don't have one. Everyone has one. Something they try when no one is listening." His voice softened slightly, but still held authority. "Something that scares them a little." The truth was, she did have one many, actually. There were pieces she played late at night when she thought no one could hear. Fast pieces that made her fingers feel like they were chasing after something unseen. Emotional pieces that made her eyes sting. But those were secrets she never imagined sharing. He waited. The pressure of the room grew heavier. The students looked at her with a mix of curiosity and impatience. She felt like she was standing at a cliff's edge. Finally, she whispered, "There is one, but I'm not sure I can play it in front of people." "Then this is the perfect place to start," he said. She took a slow breath, trying to stop her hands from shaking. She placed them gently on the keys. The familiar weight of the piano steadied her a little. She closed her eyes, letting her mind drift back to all the nights she had played in the dark of her small living room. With only the soft glow of the lamp beside her dot, then she began. The first notes came out uneven. Her nervousness showed immediately. She winced, knowing the teacher noticed. But she kept going. With every measure, her fingers grew more confident. Her body remembered the rhythm. Her hands found their path. By the time she reached the faster section, something shifted inside her. Her fear didn't disappear, but it blended into the music, pushing her forward. The sound filled the room with a kind of energy that hadn't been there before. Raw, emotional, unpolished, but alive. Students leaned forward in their seats. Some whispered quietly, surprised by the intensity of her playing. The teacher didn't move. He watched her hands, his face unreadable but focused. It was as if he was analyzing every detail. How she phrased each line, where she breathed, how her fingers curved. When she reached a difficult run of fast notes, her fingers stumbled for a split second. She felt heat rise to her cheeks. She almost stopped, but the teacher spoke, barely above a whisper. "Keep going." And she did. The final section was softer, almost like a confession in musical form. She played it with a trembling tenderness, letting the room fall into complete stillness. When the last note faded, she didn't open her eyes. She didn't want to see their faces. She wasn't sure if she had embarrassed herself or moved them. A long silence followed. Then the teacher spoke. "You're afraid of mistakes," he said. "But you're not afraid of emotion. That's rare." Lena let her eyes open slowly. She looked at him with uncertainty, not knowing if he was praising or criticizing her. He continued, Technique can be taught. Emotion cannot. And what you showed. Just now most students spend years trying to understand. A soft murmur traveled through the room. Lena's breath caught. She didn't know if he was exaggerating or being kind, or simply telling the truth. Then, without warning, he turned to the class. "Everyone sit," he instructed sharply. The students scrambled into chairs. Confused, he gestured toward the piano. "What she just played, this is what real playing sounds like. Not perfect, but honest. And honesty at the piano is more important than flawless execution." The students looked at Lena with a new kind of expression. Not pity, not doubt, but something closer to respect. She felt her cheeks warm. She didn't feel like she deserved any of that. She hadn't come here to impress anyone. She hadn't even planned to walk inside. Then the teacher turned back to her. His voice softened. "But now that I've heard you try, I want to see what happens when you are truly pushed." Her heart jumped. "Pushed?" He nodded slowly. "There is one piece every pianist fears. One that tests everything's speed, strength, precision, control. A piece that separates those who merely play from those who live in the music." The students murmured, recognizing what he was talking about. Lena looked at him nervously. "What piece?" The teacher stepped closer. His voice lowered, becoming more intense. "La Campanella." Lena felt her throat tighten. She knew the piece well. She had listened to recordings of it hundreds of times, amazed by how impossible it sounded. The jumps, the speed, the delicate touch, it was like trying to catch falling stars. That's one of the hardest pieces ever written," she whispered. "Yes," he said, "which is why I want to hear what you do with it." Her pulse quickened. "I've never played it, not even alone. Then this is the moment to change that." The student stared at her, waiting. Her hands felt cold. Her vision blurred slightly from nerves. "I don't think I—" she began, but the teacher interrupted, not unkindly. "You think you're not ready. But sometimes readiness comes after the attempt, not before it." She looked down at the keys. They seemed suddenly heavier, more distant. The room waited out every breath. Every heartbeat felt louder. Finally, the teacher spoke again, quietly but firmly. "Play it, Lena, even if you fail. Especially if you fail. That's how music works." She exhaled slowly. Then, with trembling fingers, she placed her hands on the keys. She didn't know what was about to happen. She didn't know if she would embarrass herself in front of everyone. She didn't know if she would make it through the first page. All she knew was that her heart was pounding in a rhythm, not unlike the opening of La Campanella. And whether she liked it or not, the moment had arrived. She pressed the first note. Lena sat perfectly still for a moment before she allowed her fingers to move again. The first note of the piece rang out sharp and clear, almost too bright in the quiet room. It surprised even her. La Campanella was nothing like the gentle piece she had played earlier. This one was bold, fast, filled with sudden jumps that demanded complete control. She knew she couldn't control it, not fully, not yet. But she also knew she had to try. Her fingers moved to the next notes, then the next. At first, her playing felt stiff, like she was trying to chase the music rather than become part of it. She knew this piece only through hearing it, never through playing it. But she kept going, even when her breath caught in her chest. The students leaned forward. No one dared whisper now. The teacher stood just slightly behind her, watching closely. His face didn't show impatience or irritation, only deep focus, as if every tiny movement of her hands mattered. Lena reached the first set of jumps. Her fingers lifted higher than she was used to, searching for the correct keys. She hit them, but not perfectly. One note came out slightly late, and she felt her stomach twist. She almost stopped, But then the teacher said quietly, "Don't freeze. Let the piece breathe." His voice steadied her. She nodded just barely, then pushed forward, trying again. The next jumps were harder. Her hands had to leap across the keyboard in an instant, landing lightly, then leaving again. She hit one wrong note, then two. The mistakes echoed sharply in her ears, but she didn't stop. She kept playing, forcing herself to move through the errors. The piece wasn't meant to be perfect. He had said that. What mattered was that she tried. Slowly, something in her began to shift. Her hands found a rhythm. The awkward stiffness faded bit by bit. Her fingers started to follow the shape of the melody instead of just chasing it. She was no longer fighting the piece. She was learning to ride it. The room felt warmer. Her heartbeat slowed just enough for her to breathe. When she reached the sparkling high notes, she felt a sudden burst of energy. Those notes were fast, almost too fast, but she tried anyway. Her fingers danced carefully, like walking across thin ice. Some notes came out uneven, but others rang beautifully, bright and crisp. They filled the conservatory with a sound she had only ever heard through headphones. She couldn't believe she was the one making those sounds. The students stared, stunned into silence. A few of them had attempted La Campanella before, but only in private lessons or with sheet music in front of them. They certainly hadn't played it from memory or without preparation. But here was a girl with no formal training, trying to play it on her very first attempt. Halfway through, her hands began to ache. She never practiced this fast for this long. The runs were demanding, the jumps exhausting. Sweat formed along her palms, making the keys feel slippery. She wiped her hands on her skirt quickly, and kept going. She felt a tremble in her right hand, a sign she was pushing herself too hard. Her breathing grew shallow, but she forced air back into her lungs. She didn't want to stop now when she was already this far, the teacher noticed. His voice came out low and steady. "Relax your wrist. Don't lock your hand. Let the notes fall, not fight." She loosened her grip on the keys just slightly, and the next few notes flowed easier. The piece was still too hard for her. She knew that. Everyone knew that. But something in the teacher's presence kept her going. He wasn't pushing her out of cruelty. He was pushing her because he saw something she, D-I-D-N single quotes T, dot, and slowly, she began to sense what he saw. She made mistakes, many of them. Wrong notes, uneven rhythm, rushed passages. But she also created moments of pure sound that surprised even herself. Moments where her fingers moved without doubt. Moments where the music felt like it was lifting her, carrying her forward. And then she reached the part of La Campanella she feared the most. A long sequence of fast, repetitive high notes, followed by wide leaps. It was the section she always admired in recordings, the part she believed only true masters could play. She took a breath, let her hands hover for a split second, and began. The first few notes were shaky. Her fingers nearly slipped. But then something unexpected happened. Her hands remembered the pattern, not because she had practiced it, but because she had listened to it so many times that the music felt burned into her memory. Her fingers began to follow the sound she carried in her mind. Left hand jump, jump, jump. Right hand light, bright, almost like bells. She missed some keys, but others landed perfectly. And those few perfect notes shone so clearly that they filled the room with a kind of magic. The students couldn't look away. The teacher's face softened just a little. Lena was too focused to notice. Her entire world narrowed to the keyboard. Every note existed only for the split second she touched it. She wasn't thinking about the room or the people or the mistakes. She was only thinking about the next sound, the next moment. By the time she reached the final section, her hands were shaking badly. Her shoulders were tense, her arms tired. She didn't know if she could finish, but she tried. She pushed herself through the final run of notes, letting the music rush ahead of her like a fast-moving river. She followed it, stumbling at times, steady at others, but always moving forward. When she played the final note bright, sharp, like a small bell, she lifted her hands immediately. Almost gasping, the room was silent, completely silent. Lena's breath came out uneven. She looked down at her hands, surprised they were still attached to her body. Her fingers felt numb. Her palms were damp with sweat. She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She didn't dare look at anyone. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the teacher took a slow step forward. His eyes were fixed on her, not with anger or disappointment, but with something much deeper, a kind of stunned focus. "Stand up," he said quietly. Lena stood shakily. She clasped her hands together to hide their trembling. The teacher approached the piano and touched one of the keys with a gentle fingertip, letting it ring softly. "Do you know," he said slowly, "what most students do when they are faced with something impossible?" Lena shook her head slightly. "They avoid it. They pretend they need more time. They say they're not ready." He paused. "But you tried. You didn't run away. And you didn't stop, not even when the piece pushed back." Lena lowered her gaze. "I made so many mistakes." "Yes," he said, "but mistakes are not failure. Refusing to try is failure." The students watched silently, some nodding, some unsure. The teacher continued, his voice growing slightly more intense. "You played La Campanella on your first attempt, without training, without sheet music, without preparation. Do you understand how rare that is?" Lena didn't answer. She didn't believe she deserved praise, not for something so full of errors. He took another step closer. "Most young pianists never dare to attempt that piece. And yet you did. You faced something that even experienced players fear. And you didn't break." Lena's throat tightened. She felt a sudden urge to sit down again, afraid her legs might give out. Then the teacher turned to the class. "Every one of you should learn from what she just did," he said firmly. "She showed courage. Real courage. Not the kind that comes from confidence, but the kind that comes from vulnerability." The students looked at Lena with a new expression, one she didn't recognize. It wasn't pity or admiration. It was something deeper, like they were seeing her for the first time. The teacher faced her again. "Lena, you have something I cannot teach." His voice softened. "But there is much I can teach you, if you let me." Her eyes lifted slightly. "Teach me?" He nodded. "If you want to become a real pianist, if you want to go beyond what you already have, I can help you. But you must be willing to work harder than you've ever worked before." Lena's breath shook. The idea of training under someone like him felt impossible. Unreal. She had never even dreamed of something like that. "Why? Why me?" she whispered. The teacher looked at the piano, then back at her. "Because talent is common, but passion, true passion, is rare. And I heard it today." Her chest tightened, a mix of fear and hope swirling inside her. He extended a hand slightly, not for her to shake, but as an invitation. "The path will be difficult," he warned. "You will fail many times. But if you stay committed, you will grow. More than you think possible." Lena hesitated. She looked at the keys, still glowing faintly under the soft room lights. She thought about all the nights she played alone. All the times she wondered if she was wasting time. All the moments she doubted herself. And then she thought about how she felt while playing, the way the music made her forget her fears. Even for a second, she finally looked at the teacher. "I'll try," she said softly. A small smile, not a wide one, but a subtle, approving one touched the teacher's face. "Good," he said. "Then your real journey begins now." And with that, everything in Lena's life began to shift quietly, but unmistakably. The next morning arrived quietly, almost too quietly, as if the world outside the small apartment sensed the tension inside. The young pianist woke before the sun had fully risen. She lay still for a few moments, listening to the faint hum of early traffic. Her mind was already running, already replaying the moment when the accomplished pianist froze after hearing her play. That moment replayed again and again. Like a scratch on a record she could not smooth out. She sat up slowly, stretching her hands, feeling the familiar stiffness in her fingers that always came before a long day of practice. She knew she needed to face what had happened, even if she didn't fully understand it. The accomplished pianist's reaction had left her with too many questions. Why did she freeze? Why did she look so shaken? Why hadn't she said a word afterward? She moved to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. The apartment was still dim. She didn't bother turning on the light. She just stood there, drinking quietly, staring at the piano in the next room. Its polished surface reflected the faint morning glow, almost like it was waiting on her dot. She walked over to the piano and gently touched the keys. They felt cold, reminding her of the silence that filled the room the moment she finished the piece. Yesterday, she took a deep breath and sat down. She didn't start playing right away. Instead, she let her fingers rest on the keys, as if the piano could somehow tell her what to do next. But nothing came. No inspiration. No comfort. Only more questions. She sighed and stood up. She needed answers, but sitting in the apartment wasn't going to give them to her. She grabbed her bag, slipped on her shoes, and stepped outside. The walk to the music center felt longer than usual. Every step made her more aware of the uncertainty ahead. The air was cold, and the breeze seemed to brush past her without warmth. The streets were filled with early risers, most of them rushing to work, unaware of the strange moment still lingering in her mind. When she reached the building, she stopped in front of the entrance. She wasn't sure what she expected. Maybe the accomplished pianist would be waiting for her again. Maybe she would offer some explanation. She walked inside and made her way down the hall. The rehearsal rooms were quiet. Normally, she could hear scales being practiced or instructors giving early lessons. Not today. She reached the room where everything had happened. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob before she slowly pushed it open. The room was empty. She stepped inside anyway, letting the door close behind her. The piano sat in the same place. The chairs were still arranged the same way. The air felt still, almost too still. She walked toward the piano and ran her hand along the polished surface. Suddenly, the door behind her opened. She turned quickly. It was the accomplished pianist, but something was different today. Her usually confident posture seemed softened. Her expression held something between concern and guilt. The young pianist's heart tightened. The accomplished pianist stepped inside and closed the door gently behind her. She approached slowly, as if unsure of how close she was allowed to come. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," she said quietly. The young pianist swallowed. "I had to." The accomplished pianist nodded and looked down at the floor. "I owe you an explanation." The young pianist waited. She didn't dare speak. The accomplished pianist took a deep breath, as though steadying herself. "When I asked you to play that piece, I thought I knew what to expect." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But I didn't." The young pianist frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" The accomplished pianist walked slowly to the piano and touched the keys. "That piece is considered one of the hardest in the world for a reason. It demands more than technical skill. It demands emotion, experience, discipline. Most people take years before they even attempt it." She looked back at her. "But you played it with something I haven't heard in a very long time." The young pianist felt her breath catch. She didn't know whether to feel proud or confused. "It wasn't just your accuracy," the accomplished pianist continued. It was something else. Something I wasn't prepared for. She paused again. It reminded me of someone I knew. Someone who used to play it the same way. The young pianist stepped a little closer. Who? The accomplished pianist hesitated before answering. A student I once had. A brilliant one. She had the same instinct you have. The same raw connection to music. But she ... Her voice softened. She left, suddenly, and I never heard from her again. The young pianist felt a sting in her chest. She had not expected this. The accomplished pianist continued. When you played yesterday, it felt like she was in the room again. It was overwhelming. I didn't freeze because you played badly. I froze because you played in a way that brought back something I thought I had lost forever. The room grew quiet. The young pianist looked down at her hands. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Finally, she said softly, I didn't mean to bring up anything painful. The accomplished pianist shook her head. You didn't. You reminded me of why I fell in love with music in the first place. She stepped toward her. But it scared me too. Because I don't want to fail you the way I failed her. The young pianist's eyes widened. She had never seen the accomplished pianist look so vulnerable. I want to help you, the accomplished pianist said. If you'll let me. The young pianist took a breath. I want to learn, she said quietly. But I also want honesty. If something is wrong, I want you to tell me. If I remind you of someone, I want you to tell me why. The accomplished pianist nodded slowly. I can do that. The young pianist stepped closer to the piano. So ... What happens now? The accomplished pianist gave a small, gentle smile. Now we start again. Properly this time. She motioned toward the bench. The young pianist sat. The accomplished pianist stood beside her, watching carefully. As though afraid to rush anything. Let's begin with something familiar, she said softly. The young pianist placed her fingers on the keys. She took a deep breath. This time, when she played the first note, the accomplished pianist did not freeze. She closed her eyes, listening not to a memory, but to the girl in front of her. For the first time, both of them were ready to face whatever came next. But deep in the accomplished pianist's expression, there was still something she hadn't said, something she wasn't ready to reveal. And though the young pianist didn't know it yet, the truth behind that silence would shape everything that happened after this moment. The following week moved forward with a rhythm of its own. Each day, the young pianist arrived at the music center early, long before the halls filled with students and instructors. And each day, the accomplished pianist met her with a careful calm, as if trying not to push too hard or move too fast. Their practices became a quiet routine, steady, focused, filled with questions and gentle corrections. But beneath that calm surface, something else was building. A pressure neither of them talked about, though both could feel. The accomplished pianist was different somehow. Softer at times, tougher at others, but always watchful, always studying her as if trying to understand something that could not be put into words yet. And the young pianist felt herself growing too, not just in skill, but in awareness. She became more attuned to the slight pauses in her mentor's voice, the moments where her expression tightened, and the rare seconds where she looked away, as if hiding a thought. Still, she didn't ask. Not yet. She wanted to trust the process, to trust that the truth would come when it was ready. One afternoon, after nearly 5 hours of practice, they took a short break. The young pianist leaned back on the bench, stretching her fingers. The accomplished pianist walked to the window and looked outside at the courtyard below. Students were gathering in small groups, some laughing, some sharing snacks, some carrying their instruments. The room felt unusually quiet. Your progress is faster than I expected, the accomplished pianist said suddenly. Still looking out the window, the young pianist smiled softly. You teach well. That's not why, her mentor replied gently. She turned, her eyes thoughtful. You learn differently from most people. You don't just copy movements. You absorb meaning, emotion, intention. That's rare. Very rare. The young pianist lowered her gaze. Compliments still felt strange to her. She wasn't used to them. After a few moments, the accomplished pianist walked back toward the piano. Let's try it again. The final movement. The young pianist nodded and prepared herself. Her fingers were tired, but she wanted to continue. She wanted to push further. She began to play. The room filled with the sound of fast-moving notes, sharp, clear, and filled with intensity. The piece demanded everything: speed, control, precision, emotion. Her hands moved confidently, almost instinctively. When she reached the last page of the sheet music, she glanced up briefly. The accomplished pianist's expression had changed again. Something was happening behind her eyes, something the young pianist did not understand. Still, she kept playing. She reached the end of the movement, lifted her hands gently from the keys, and let the last note linger in the air. Silence followed. Deep silence. The accomplished pianist stepped back as if she needed distance. She pressed her fingers to her lips and turned slightly away. The young pianist's heart tightened. Did I play it wrong? No, her mentor whispered. You played it too well. The young pianist felt a jolt of confusion. What does that mean? The accomplished pianist paced slowly, her breaths uneven. This piece, it isn't just difficult. It carries weight, history, emotion, pain. It belongs to someone who put everything they had into it. And the way you play it, it's almost the same. She paused. Too similar. The young pianist felt her pulse quicken. I'm sorry if that hurts you. I'm not trying to copy anyone. I know, her mentor said softly. That's what makes it so overwhelming. You aren't trying, but somehow you're reaching the same place she did. The young pianist took a slow breath. Your former student? The accomplished pianist's gaze darkened. Yes, what happened to her? The young pianist asked gently. For a long moment, her mentor didn't speak. She looked at the piano, then at the floor, and finally at the young pianist. She disappeared, she said quietly. One day she was here. The next day she was gone. No message. No contact. Nothing. The young pianist listened without speaking. The accomplished pianist continued, her voice low. She had so much talent, even more than I realized at the time. But she carried everything alone. Every pressure, every expectation, every fear. I didn't see it. I didn't help her when I should have. And when she needed support the most, I pushed her instead. I expected greatness when she needed kindness. She closed her eyes for a moment, and then she left. I never heard from her again. The room grew still. The young pianist felt warmth in her chest, a mix of sadness and understanding. I'm not her. I know, her mentor replied, her voice cracking slightly. But watching you, teaching you, it feels like I'm being given a second chance. The young pianist stepped closer. Then let's make it right this time. You don't have to be afraid. The accomplished pianist looked at her, her eyes softening with something fragile. Something hopeful. She nodded slowly, gratefully. They returned to the piano. The accomplished pianist spoke gently. Let's stop here for today. You've done more than enough. The young pianist agreed, though she sensed there was more behind the decision. A tension still lingered, like a note that hadn't fully resolved. As she packed her things, the accomplished pianist stepped closer. Before you go, there's something I want to ask. The young pianist turned. What is it? Tomorrow, her mentor said slowly, there will be someone visiting the center. Someone who once knew that former student. Someone who may be able to tell us what happened to her. The young pianist felt a small shiver move up her spine. Why are they coming? To hear you play? Her mentor held her gaze. Because after what I saw today, I think you might be connected to this story more than either of us realized. The young pianist's breath caught. Connected? How? She couldn't ask. Not yet. Fear and curiosity twisted together in her chest. The accomplished pianist gently touched her shoulder. Don't be scared. Nothing bad will happen. I just want answers. For both of us. The young pianist nodded slowly. She left the room with a mind full of questions. The hallway felt longer than usual. Each step carried a weight she couldn't name. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. She wasn't sure what this mysterious visitor would say. But she felt something shifting, something big. Something unavoidable as she stepped outside into the cool evening air. She looked down at her hands. Same hands that played the hardest piece. The same hands that made the accomplished pianist. Freezed out the same hands that somehow connected her to someone she had never met. Tomorrow. She would find out why and the truth waiting for her would change everything. The journey back to town was quiet, filled with the weight of the discovery they had just made. The chest was now safely in their hands, but it felt as though it contained more than just objects and letters. It held the essence of a long-forgotten story, a story that had been waiting to be uncovered for decades. The group walked in a slow procession, their steps almost synchronized, as if they were all aware that this moment would change everything. The town of Briar Hill seemed unchanged as they made their way back through the streets. The old buildings, the quiet homes, and the familiar faces all looked the same as they had before the mystery began. But for those who had uncovered the secret of the piano, everything felt different. The weight of the past hung in the air, and the knowledge they carried with them now felt like a thread that connected the present with a forgotten time. When they returned to the hall, they carefully set the chest down in the center of the room. The piano sat in the corner, looking as unassuming as ever, but it was no longer just an old instrument. It was part of a bigger story, and now everyone in the town would know it. As the group gathered around the chest, the historian felt a wave of emotion. She had always been drawn to the past, to the stories that people had left behind, but this was different. This wasn't just an old document or an artifact. It was a piece of the town's soul. The piano, the letters, and the photograph were all part of a deeper connection, a bond that had been lost, but now had been found again. Someone in the group spoke first. We need to share this with the town. Everyone needs to know what we've uncovered. There was a moment of hesitation, as if everyone was thinking the same thing. This was a story that belonged to the whole town, not just the small group who had stumbled upon it. But sharing it also meant revealing something that might change how people saw their town, how they saw themselves. Do you think they'll understand? Someone asked. I don't know, the historian replied. But this is part of our history. It's something that has been hidden for too long. And with that, they made the decision. It was time to tell the story. The group spent the next few days preparing. They wanted to make sure the story was told right. The chest, the letters, and the photograph would be displayed in the town hall for everyone to see. They would invite everyone, families, elders, even the children, to come and learn about the forgotten history that had been buried under layers of time. The piano would remain in its corner, now a symbol of connection between past and present. As the evening approached, the townspeople began to gather. The hall filled with murmurs of curiosity. Some had heard whispers about what had been found, but most of them had no idea what the group was about to reveal. The historian, standing at the front of the room, looked out at the faces in the crowd. She felt a nervousness rise in her chest, but also a sense of pride. This was something important. This was the moment when the story would finally be told. She cleared her throat and began. It started with the discovery of an old piano, she said, her voice steady. An instrument that had been sitting forgotten in the town hall for years. But when we opened it, we found something much more than we expected. Inside, we found a map and a letter that spoke of something much bigger, something tied to the very heart of our town. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, everyone listening intently. We followed the map, and it led us to a place in the hills. There we uncovered a chest. Inside, we found letters, objects, and a photograph that told a story. The story of a family who lived here many years ago, a family whose music had brought people together, and who had hidden something important, something that belonged to everyone in this town. The historian then explained everything they had, discovered the mysterious family, the piano, and the significance of the symbol they had seen everywhere. She spoke of the photograph, the woman and the man who had been part of the family, and how they had left behind a legacy that had been passed down through generations. The townspeople listened in stunned silence. It was a story unlike any they had ever heard before, a story that connected them to a past they had no idea existed. There were whispers, nods of recognition, and a few tears in the crowd. The historian's words had opened a door to something they had never fully understood. "We don't know everything," she said as she finished her story. "But what we do know is that the piano, the music, and the family were all part of something bigger. They were trying to create a bond, something that would help people understand where they came from. And now it's our turn to carry that legacy forward." The room was still for a moment, as if everyone was absorbing what they had just heard. Then, someone in the back of the room stood up. It was an elderly man, one of the town's oldest residents. "I remember," he said, his voice shaky but filled with conviction. "I remember the piano. I remember the music." The room fell silent again as the man spoke. He told the crowd about the days when the piano had been played regularly in the town hall, how the music had brought people together. He remembered the family who had once lived here, the family who had been so kind and so full of life. He talked about the piano as if it were a part of his own memories. "I was just a boy back then," he continued, "but I remember the way it felt when the music filled the room. It was like everything was right in the world. And then, one day, they were gone. Nobody ever knew what happened to them. But I always wondered." He trailed off, his voice heavy with the weight of years. The historian stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You weren't the only one," she said softly. "None of us knew. But now we do." The man nodded slowly, tears in his eyes. I'm glad that the story is finally being told." The crowd was quiet for a moment, each person processing the story in their own way. The historian looked out at the faces in the crowd, and for the first time, she felt a deep connection to them. The mystery that had been buried for so long was no longer just a secret. It was part of their shared history. And then, someone in the back raised their hand. "What happens now?" they asked. The historian smiled, knowing that the answer was simple. "Now," she said, "we carry the legacy forward. The music, the story, the bond that was created all those years ago. We honor it by remembering and by sharing it with the next generation." As the crowd began to disperse, there was a sense of peace in the air. The mystery had been solved, but it wasn't just the answers that mattered. It was the way the town had come together to uncover the truth. The piano, once forgotten, had now become a symbol of connection, of history, and of the power of music to bring people together. The historian stood in the center of the hall, looking around at the faces of the townspeople. She felt a sense of pride that she had never known before. This wasn't just her story, or the story of the group who had uncovered the mystery. It was the town's story, a story that had been waiting to be told. And with that, The forgotten grand piano, once hidden in the shadows, had finally revealed its secrets. The town of Briar Hill would never be the same again. The mystery had ended, but the legacy would live on forever.